Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Contemplative Science Center and the East Asia Center and the Tibet Center to today's Dialog. And if you're interested in the Contemplative Science Center activity, then uvacontemplation.org. You can sign up for its mailing list for getting announcements about this and other types of events, and you can do the same for searching on East Asia Center UVA or Tibet Center UVA. My name is David Germano, and I'm the director of the Contemplative Science Center as well as the director of the Tibet Center. And so I'm going to be giving an introduction as well as being the interlocutor in terms of the conversation tonight with Khenpo Tsultrim Lodrö, who I have the great pleasure to introduce. And the translation will be done by Catherine Hardy, who's finishing up her doctorate at Oxford and who actually has done her PhD or is doing her PhD on Tibetan and Chinese interrelationships over religious issues in a focus on the monastic community that Khenpo Tsultrim Lodrö heads. So we're very grateful to her to be here and act as that intermediary. So in way of introduction, it's a very personal visit for me because I first met Khenpo Tsultrim Lodrö when we were both in our late 20s or maybe mid to late 20s, and we had the same Tibetan teacher. And that teacher, whose name was Khenpo Jigme Phunstok, went to an empty valley in 1980, an empty valley in rural Tibet. When you say rural Tibet, that's really rural. It's not like rural Virginia. It's way out there. And this was up in the grasslands, and it was a valley that was empty because it was empty. It wasn't empty because a monastery had been destroyed or there was something going on there in the past. It was just an empty valley. That was one he had his own reasons for going to. And since 1980 to the present, it has grown to an institution of learning, of Tibetan learning, that is perhaps the same or larger than the University of Virginia. A massive infrastructure and a massive number of people, especially monks and nuns, but also a number of lay people and a lot of Chinese people, and as you can see from myself and Catherine, also a number of European and American and Australian, you'll notice as soon as she talks, Australian people also coming there to learn and to study. And it's a distinctively Tibetan place. It's a densely Tibetan place. It's a monastic university in the best possible sense of the word, where they study a broad variety of traditional forms of knowledge, and it's become the largest Tibetan Buddhist community in the world for sure, and certainly one of the largest Buddhist monasteries in the world today. And Khenpo Tsultrim Lodrö has been a monk since 1984, when he was 22 years old. And I think he has certainly emerged as one of the greatest religious figures in Tibet today, who is renowned on multiple fronts. On the one hand, he has emerged as perhaps the dominant ethical voice amongst Tibetan religious leaders in Tibet itself. It's hard to say he's the founder of the vegetarian movement in Tibet, but he's certainly its most prominent spokesperson. And for those of you who think, well, so what? Aren't all Tibetans vegetarian? No, not even close. It's a meat eater's paradise, as I like to say. It certainly was not a vegetarian's paradise. And so the movement for taking traditional Buddhist values and ethical principles and establishing this vegetarian movement and animals' rights movement has really been an extraordinary process over the last 3 decades that Khenpo Tsultrim Lodrö has been at the center of. He's also one of the great traditional intellects in Tibet, who's kind of authored through audio-video recordings as well as books, a broad variety of traditional commentaries on Buddhist scholastic knowledge on an immense, diverse array of subjects. He's also a very prominent contemplative himself in his own practice and in his teaching. And finally, he's a social innovator. The monastery itself is essentially a social enterprise of extraordinary character that's involved in a broad variety of activities, not only traditional, but also getting into lay communities and acting as an ethical voice, but also spurring specific kinds of initiatives, offering services of variety of kinds, community libraries and school systems and artisan training systems and so forth. And so Khenpo's leadership, as well as the community overall, has exemplified the idea that the life of the contemplative and the life of those who are engaged in social innovation out in society, in secular and lay society, that these two things can coexist in extraordinarily profound ways. And I remember when I first met him, it was a little bit odd because he asked me something about, actually this was maybe a little bit later, but he was asking me, what am I doing now? And I said, I'm at the University of Virginia, I'm a teacher there. And he goes, Virginia? And you have to realize, again, rural Tibet, grasslands, nobody was speaking English for many, many kilometers. And so I thought, what are you going to do with Virginia? I mean, what does that mean to you? And he starts rummaging around in his books, and he pulls out a book by a professor from the University of Virginia in Chinese translation, namely Ian Stevenson, since passed away, who was the world's foremost authority on doing research on reincarnational past life memories from our UVA medical school. And so he had read that book and immediately recognized Virginia as the home base. And on this trip also, where we've been going around and talking to a broad variety of UVA professors and researchers, we went over to the astronomy department to talk to one of our most well-known astrophysicists who has written a book on Buddhism and science. And as we were talking, and he was kind of grilling him about exotic dark matter and all these things he'd been reading about in Chinese translation, and as we were leaving, he noticed a copy of his book, which was called The Quantum and the Lotus in Chinese translation, and realized that he had also read that back in his monastery in Tibet. So this is someone who has been not only an extraordinarily learned person in traditional Buddhist and Tibetan subject matters, but also someone with an avid interest in other fields of knowledge and thinking about how these things coincide as the world changes all around us. And I think one of the great values of having him here today is that he's not one of these Tibetan teachers who is packaged for our consumption. This is the first time he's ever been in the US, and certainly he's had a lot of interface with Chinese and so forth over the years, but he represents a different world, because the world of Tibetan Buddhism even today is very different from the world we have here. And of course, as we bring these ideas into a university setting in any kind of subject matter, we package them for the consumption of our students and our public and so forth. But I thought what would be really valuable today would be to have a dialogue where you had a visceral sense of what it feels like to move from that traditional Buddhist world of learning and contemplation to this new world that we've been creating around us in America, where we think about contemplation drawn from religious sources, Catholicism or Buddhism or Native American sources or whatever it might be, Islam, and begin to adapt them for completely new settings that don't have a religious context or a religious set of values associated with them. And this is a very difficult process. And so what we're going to do today is begin by talking a bit more about that traditional Buddhist world, the world in which he grew up and was educated and was formed, and how they think about contemplation, how they learn it, what the different varieties are, and then slowly begin to talk about how that's changing in contemporary time, ending up where we are today, which is contemplation being taken and adapted in a broad variety of forms in public school systems and universities and healthcare systems, business training and so forth, and what some of the opportunities and challenges are in that movement. So please join me in welcoming Khenpo Tsultrim Lodrö. So the monastery, like the university in North America, is an institution of higher learning, and it has an organization to it. And so tell us a little bit about those monks and nuns who are actively engaged in learning programs. What is the nature of those institutions at your monastery at Larung Gar, monastery nunnery?
First of all, just like to say good evening and Dashideli to everybody here who's come to the conversation tonight. And Kempo has had a very, very good impression of the University of Virginia and is so glad to have the chance to actually be here in person tonight and have this chance to share his thoughts with you all.
데니 버지니아 로탈라 가이 김성강에서나 데니 코랑 그 짐직시야 데 차창 직팀 차창들라 짐직시는 뭐 쇼직라 짐직시는 데니
And the reason for Kempo's very favourable impression of the University of Virginia has been its multifaceted research agenda. So the fact that it undertakes researches in all areas and not just necessarily focused on one.
나초 무제한데 데니 우보 장마 말이지. 데니 우보다 데니 남시 니가 접비된 지금
The human is not just material or materiality. It's a combination of the material and consciousness. So for that reason, it's not okay if we just research the physicality of the body or the physicality of the material world. So in addition to the research on the physical nature of things, since we're comprised of both a material component and the component of our mind or consciousness, it's very important that we also do research on the latter. So in terms of us, in terms of humans, our vital life force, or what makes us human, our soul or our consciousness, is of utmost importance. So the fact that scholars and students at University of Virginia research, in fact, the human consciousness and the human mind, psychology, is a very wonderful thing. And by combining a research approach that looks at both the physical and material, and one that looks at psychology and more intangible aspects of the mind, we can develop a really healthy direction in terms of our academic research institutions. And this is the reason that I have a very good impression of the University of Virginia. And in relation to David's question about the role of monasteries as universities, Kempo says that in terms of traditional Tibetan history, the monastery was in fact the university. There was no other university aside from the monastery. But in contemporary Tibet, obviously, there are now secular institutions of higher learning in addition to traditional monasteries. And in the secular institutions of higher learning, subjects are offered like maths and various branches of science. Whereas in the monasteries, the topics of study are religious topics and traditional Tibetan sciences. The educational system in monasteries is a comprehensive and complete educational system.
Teni gumba teni malak loso malak tina la pena nga tu mo teni samba kan difego mo shiga kan difego teni mo gonlongda gonshut so to kan difego mo yakbo kan difego de koran so gumba loso mo ni yoris.
And in terms of Tibetan ideas about human morality and conduct, character, how to be a good person. These ideas are derived from the monastery.
이 되게 시속 독고로서 띠나네 되게 거라 되게 gormonso야 되게 소화가 되시고 더 띠나는 거요.
Whereas in the secular institutions of higher learning, people are really learning about how to make money and how to make livelihoods.
이 보고 조진 거를 내가 삼로 왕도 시나 실당 먹은 소화기 거래 되니 소화대야 우보대야 하장 같이 와래 대리장 같이 와도 당부 뭐야 보지 거래 삼이 거랑서 어디서 한 거예요.
In terms of the traditional Tibetan education, whilst it's acknowledged that people need to have a livelihood and that they need, material component to their existence, being a good person precedes these in importance. And so this notion of being a good person entails not doing harm to others and doing acts of benefit to others. And so the education that monasteries deliver primarily revolves around this. And in terms of Larung Gar, the monks and nuns, the residents there, the monastic residents there, pursue two streams of work or endeavour. The first being study or academic study, and the second being practice or meditation practice. And within this notion of practice, there are two parts. The first being the cultivation of one's mind, and the second being service to society.
So, I can't help but respond partially to how he characterized universities. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to say in response to that, does he really think that universities are primarily about making money and livelihood? Because that's not how we think of universities. So.
Kempo, Chezonda, the Shitsoka Lodrö Chimunalo, the Nitso, and Gumuto, the Colare. That did not so Nupshukasam, not Jones Kakare, not Fokasam, the Nita, Lodrö Chimuka, the Nuba, the Nita Draminaso Yore, the Niketi, Don't Numa, the Nikaka Lodrö, the Gumuto Yamato, the Nita, Pindashin Bayo.
Mainly it's about making money in one's livelihood. It's not to say there aren't any other benefits, but...
Now,
Kempo thinks that this is because this is primarily what the Western value of is in universities.
Well, since this isn't primarily a discussion about Western universities, I'll let that one pass. But we might come back to that. So, can you tell us, so what are the specialized organizational structures to correspond to those two types of activities? Mm-hmm. So some people are there to engage in academic study, and others are there to engage in, as you described it, a type of practice, both contemplative practice as well as practice that helps you be of more service to society. So are there organizational structures that relate to that? For example, at the university here, we have 11 schools. Mm-hmm. And those schools cater different kinds of subject matters. So how is that organizationally expressed in the monastery and nunnery?
Yeah. Larung Gar kanala di da lokten ki jutang di nyamlan ki juti muksa ga di da trumshita malaga yo.
Yes. Yes. Dios, so nala di karni buyo. Karni nani mangchi shuda. Di sojong shin di 디나니 차시 찍듯더니 다 파치더니 야차 숨치자고 또 리즈더니 또 냠미시.
yes, there are. Of the students at Larung Gar, approximately 70%, the majority, pursue the academic route, and the other 30% follow the route of practice.
Now, could he tell us how many years people would study if they were to do the full curriculum in the academic college, and how many years they would study if they did the full curriculum in the meditative college? And also, do people typically do both, or is it kind of either or?
Yeah.
다 되니 시전한 중나 되니 로카츠 정고 되니 죽다는 주가 로카츠 정고 되니 무카시디 냠디 되니 시저 죽죽자 되니 냠디 죽긴
샤자나나 로종시나 되니 로종 야보즈 그런 것 되니 당부 노름 당부니 되니 지거바데 야보즈 차성서 로종시나 로정하고 그랬어.
In terms of the academic path, if one was to pursue the full course from the first year until the end of the program, it would take 15 years.
되니 접자나라 되니 냠년 시킨도 소나라이나 되니 또 고소 양 당부니 또 타마바드 야보즈 되니 다시나 되니 로들라 되니 지고 gum gita gum yapjita tini gum yapsar sojongshi nikade ti lo dungu.
And for those who are following the path of practice, a full course would take 7 years, and those 7 years would entail learning about meditation techniques and also meditational practice.
Tani lo dunga nangla tani ta korang gum diti nangla jigzongro mare tani na ta korang gum serti lo dunga nangla ha gondro tani nyamnyum kala kang samzi tani korang yondro tani te yo sondi tani lo dunga jila tani korang sacha jambaza sondi muntani gum yapna 같이 tani korang gum sershinro tani.
And in terms of meditational practice, those 7 years are really for enabling students to gain an understanding of meditational methods and techniques. So it's assumed that within that time that they'll have a very thorough overview of meditational techniques. And during this time we'll also have been able to gain experience in meditation too, but the idea is that upon conclusion of the 7 years that they'll then be able to go on and pursue their practice beyond wherever they go after those 7 years.
And then the issue about how are the two related to each other? Is it more like some people do a bachelor's and you do a master's and a PhD, or are these really more like vocational school is for the meditation people and this is more like going to college?
니까진 그냥 요리나 몸본 말했더니 파치가 떴더니 고정 지근도 고정 지거리 했더니 gum-jam-kanta parchi tini lojong shi sarana mambu rong mare tini lojong shin kanta so zuo lojong shin ge shi ge na ti gum-jam-jam na la ro re ta na ko ti jor da bu shi ge.
In general, people follow one or the other of these paths. There are very few people who are doing both, or who formally take studies in both the academic path and the practice path. So in general, those who are doing meditational studies, they do not tend to take part in many academic classes. For those who are pursuing the academic path, they may do meditation on the side of their academic studies, but they're not formally enrolled in the meditation program.
So having spent a lot of time with both types of people in Tibet, you know, I know from experience.
Oh, that's what. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll try to speak up a little bit since Aaron said there were some problems hearing us. I certainly have no problem projecting my voice, so we'll see how you do. So my question is, having spent a lot of time with both meditators and people who've gone through 15 years, by the way, that's what he said, 15 years of academic study in order to get a monastic degree, I know that both sides can sometimes be a little less respectful of each other than you might hope. So, for example, the meditators will call the ones who do philosophical study Tokgewa, which means like, just kind of useless intellectuals, more or less. And then the ones who do the academic study will often call the meditators like mi shempa, it's like ignorant. So I'm wondering, and of course there's also examples of people who blend both and a lot of respect for both sides. But I wonder, what percentage of those would you say that actually go through the academic college really develop a deep contemplative personal practice?
Through the college, the academic path.
Yeah, not that they learn it in the college, but just along the way, as he said.
Then David Kozina, Nangyun, Dini, Burki, London, Kodini, Lojukunala, Dakoso, Dini Lopchon Kotala, Tola, Dini Shukchibu, Dini Yapkon Kotso, Dini Gumrukun, Dini Pensun Kotso Yapo, Samsayina, Dini Kotso, Pensun, Dini Zikud and Kriship Sheki Yomari Kashizina, Dini Kotso, Lopchon Sheki, Kotso, Toka was a re, Dini Kotso, Dini Gumruk, Yapkon Kotso, Dini Rigne Mebus re. Oh yeah, Dini Larung Gar ina di Kotso, Rikni Kaloma Waka, Dini Drewatang, Samso Chimusere, Dini Yimba, Dini da Tierkesamna Larung Gar Nang, Dini Larung Gar Junkin Kaloma, so Kotso, Lopchon, the Korum Tritu Muni, Gomkin Yamlin. Deni chutsu topu topkin mambo ayus.
Maranso lo jibju manchula deni yanchula sonsarti deni korang deni chapata zobata zombata kocho jikanga nala yandro go mari lo jibju yanchulindi deni korang gum tatap shikiri ngacho sherdanga chu garla jig mambo chajyo ita korang jikka nala yandro go mari.
Okay. So to start with, Kempo is starting by saying that for those who come to Larung Gar when if they are 40 years old or above, then they're not required to take part in any formal classes, so no academic classes. There are a lot of examinations at Larung Gar. That's a big component of the academic studies, and those who come to Larung Gar who are age 40 or above are not required to take part in any exams or any formal academic classes. Whereas those who are younger, particularly in their 20s, then they tend to really be doing academic study, following the study path, and they are not doing much meditation practice.
Teni ngaran tsupe na nangba di nangla teni lojong jia mambo zide di nangla kyabar tsama rapo tsama ripa rawo ina ripa halipa teni tena ripa tang zapo da teni ripa chawu jipo teni jita teni nga tsu boka chodil na yinda manda lo nishi tsaranga machula teni lojong jia dolgo zini teni zingwa.
In terms of studies of subjects like logic, which require a great deal of erudition and sharpness in the mind, the Tibetan tradition holds that it's necessary for students who want to study these things to do so before they're age 25. I suppose the assumption being that the brain's capacity weans off after this. Yes, thinking that after 25 one really can't get really good results in one's study of these subjects. Before one is 25, the ability to memorize a great deal of information, to, I suppose, spin the cogs of your brain rather quickly, to debate, all of these sorts of things are considered to be one's capacities are at their sharpest, whereas after age 25, the decline begins. So for younger students in their mid-teens to really about their mid-20s, their main pursuit is academic study and they don't really do much meditation practice at all.
내가 저 가는 잡고이나 되네. 너 숨칠라 돈이 숨칠이 집적을 받든지라 로종양 지금 고민을 잡고 니가 되죠.
And at Larung Gar, students who are around the age of 30, sort of say in 30s towards 40, they're expected to do both study and meditation practice. And after age 40, then not much academic study. The main thing is meditation practice. Of course, there are exceptions to the general rule. There are some people who start to learn meditation at a very young age, 15 or age 16, and there are also some people who at age 50 and 60 are still reading books.
Well, there's hope for all of us. So I'd like to just briefly go through the 7 years. So the 15 years of the academic college, we're going to skip for sure. But the 7 years of the meditation college, if we could just briefly go through those 7 and talk about what the practice is, but also in kind of non-traditional terms, what he thinks is the benefit of that practice. I mean, he's been asking all week long people in the nursing school and education and business and so forth, why do you do that meditative practice? What's the benefit of it? And so we want to turn the table and ask him this time, what's the benefit of that practice? And let's start with the first year. Okay. And the first year is called the Ordinary Preliminary Practices, and it's a set of narrative, analytical meditations on Buddhist philosophy.
Tini Kempo Tsultrim Tini Kyundung Lodrö Tini Lo Tambo ina di Hongonjo ke Tini Tumung Hongonjo re Tini Keti di Tumung Hongonjo Tini ta Pingyun Zo Tini Taptepo ke Gone Hongonjo Shebo na
Tini ga zo Chu na la ina tini Mange ta hale pa tini Karchim la tini Zeng do Tini na Hongonjo zena Shitang ga so ramba julu ko wan shi na pena Hongonjo ta shota sobchung go tini ta tini doji ta sobchung go tini sobchung ta tini ziri goram thomong go wan shi na rite yena karchi jung go wan shi na te pe halipa karchim bos la tsangdus.
In terms of religious practice, the foundations are considered extremely important. So the first year of the preliminary practice is essentially the base of practice that goes up in graduated levels beyond this. It can be considered, I suppose, in analogy to a school system as grade 1 or the very first year, but in terms of its importance, it's vitally important for everything that's going to come after that.
Ngatu gumjam na yangja, teni nombando na yangja, teni shiso kotola shawa ya pole na yangja, teni tusu sambala mugir jamada mambore seti, mugir jamada mambore, tena kashok jamada mambo, lamkan jamada mambore, teni chorang chu jabi nekam na lamka kang landrote, teni hondote teni tago res, hondote lamka kang landrota ore, ta hondote moni translation na gadi kankor ta res,
yeah, that's all. So really, of the many kinds of practices we can undertake, meditation or recitation, positive, meritorious acts in society, there are many motivations or reasons for which we can do these things. So really the key function or purpose of the preliminaries, the first year of the common preliminary practices, is to determine the direction that one's future meditation or religious practice is going to take. It's setting the right direction or the accurate direction for one's practice after this. So Kempo said that we can look upon the preliminary practices as the steering wheel that's going to take us on further in our meditation or practice careers.
tene sheko gomya ga jone te chikpa ina tene tela yang khorang ga tene lamkha mambo khorang ga mjewa to mambo series pe na nga so jone de gomna so nekap se tene nga so sem go non shik me ban ra ta tene so rang la sem su yong ya nga so sin ji dang ji de jin ja bo to la gomji yang do se tene te mayam ba tene nga so tharwa thoba ga chi te tene gomji yang do de jin di ko so la tene gomji chi na tene ko shokkan 그 shokto muir kan la gom tela hachang ka chang ti muir te te ko lamka kan la do te ni mondo ta go re te ni hachang ka chang
Meditational practices can be put to a number of different goals. For example, shamatha practice can be used to quieten one's mind, to reduce one's stress, etc. For a variety of what Kempo refers to as chicken soup for the soul purposes. Alternatively, or at the same time, it can form a part of our practice towards ultimate enlightenment. So really the direction to which we are going to orient our practice activities is really determined by the foundation and the direction that we set during our preliminary practice.
Really nga so lamka te simrisi lamka simdu nga so chuna lamka simdu lamka chiti so sendi thola ina chishima ina teni demo che po yongya dang sende dang chishima la teni so gun chowa demo che po yongya teni semkam demo che po yongya zipo demo che po yongya teni zik to ndak la teni gumje chinglu te chingris teni ni pa de teni so rang mi ger ke teni ta jewa gawa nawa chewa dumar tamcho pa mebashini marang rang tini ta kirga na chi dumar mebatini je yen sambi tini moira ni badiri tani moira sambate tini ta me semjin tamcho pola tini te Phunstok yen semjin tamcho pola me ropa je yen di ton de tini ne gomgu yen samni tani samgo re tini desum lamka kanlando tini modo tapcha go re tini modo ta haliba tini kachim boris.
Traditionally, the different paths that religious practice can be oriented towards are conceived as three. The first being one's worldly happiness and well-being, prosperity, etc., not only in this life but also in future lives to come. The second path being one's own liberation from suffering, the suffering of samsaric existence, and then the third path being the elimination of suffering for all beings.
Okay, so the first set of preliminary practices then he largely described as motivational in character, that it's reflecting upon your motivation, your intention, and how this is going to shape other practices that you engage in. And so the actual practices are like these guided reflections upon impermanence and suffering and one's agency and so forth. The second year, people then go on with that as a background to do what are called the extraordinary preliminary practices. And the extraordinary preliminary practices are quite different. And so I wonder if you could explain to us a little bit, I'm going to ask a very specific question. So you do these practices 100,000 times for each one, 5 different practices, each one done 100,000 times. And the first two involve visualizing what they call an assembly tree, where all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and teachers and so forth of your lineage are visualized in front of you, and you prostrate while reciting a prayer. And the first 100,000 times, the prayer is basically saying, I go for refuge, or I join this community and the Buddha, his community, his teaching. And the second 100,000 you do by generating this third motivation he talked about to benefit all living beings. You say a 4-line prayer that represents that aspiration, you prostrate, and you visualize that. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about having a year where people spend doing that kind of activity, visualizing Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and teachers in his or her lineage and so forth. What does that do to a person's mind? Not so much the traditional explanation, but what would a year of doing that, like if we spend a year just visualizing, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, or whoever, the people that make up our heritage, that's some people's heritage, others would have other figures, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, whoever. What does that do to someone's mind? What's the benefit of that?
Teni di munro ko loro nipa nanga di tumo mui mo bosiriyo. Tati nanga teni di capsule tang teni da singi ko yore. Tati teni pe nanga da nga so ransu so jitka lama tang changsu samba sangi ga teni sodep shekore. Teni yun bos yang ne yang de temo zo ko pomgyap na penyun zo wujire. Rang ka sim nanga rang ki jut nanga chizu ko penyun re.
나저 로 담보도 되니 차성위 지니 되니 로 니바가 나한테라 되니 원조리 되니 원조 니바들 되니 원조 니바들나 고미아들라 소도 간 고보드즈나 그런 거 곰고 되니核心지나 소고마다 오도 저도 상식 그 셈고 말이지 쉐방 나요래 나가나 리스트 되니 상식 그 셈브리도 대 소고마다 오리지
So after the first year of the preliminaries are completed and we move on to the second stage, there are 5 practices among the extraordinary preliminaries, but the core of them, the pith of these practices, is really the cultivation of bodhicitta.
Tini dari ngasobenga tini lama mambo tini ta sanji shakya tapani tawa tini mambo tini yongyore. 대소라 소란데 기타한테 구파티 강레제나 그나 되니 상계 샤자타 바다 되니 상계 되니 다 수고난 거 되니 그런 거 상계 되니 똑바스네 고도 상계 이시 지휘 대 내가 가서 되니 되니 춤줬잖아 고다 수이쿠 춤줬다고 그랬어 아니 아 되니 티 바나 되니 라마 mambo 요파티 되니 춤줬 되니 관다오지나 된다 와서레스 되니 나초 다 무슨 배야 용편도 라마데 되니 나초 춤나 용편도 더 쳐수는
So in terms of visualizing the various lamas from our lineage, stretching back to the Sakyamuni Buddha himself, the reason that we do this is it connects us like a pipe from the reservoir of the Buddha's wisdom, which is like a reservoir. The lamas that have successively, generation after generation, taken place since then are like the pipe itself. And then our own lama that we have the fortune of encountering in this life is like the faucet to this wisdom.
야나 가서 되니 상계 샤자타 파우티니 상계가 되니 예시 상계가 되니 똑바 상계가 예시도 배나 가서 올록거든요. 올록한다고 그랬어요. 바디엔차다고 그랬어요. 아니 나 라마티와나 mambo 소지도 되니 가서 올록 급하다고 그랬어요. 아니 나초 당 제와 나초 랑가 라마데 아니 되니 올록거든요. 되니 올록동마로 당파다고 그랬어요.
Or we could understand it using the metaphor of a power station, where the Buddha's original realization is the power station, and then the lamas or the teachers, the realized ones who have occurred since then, are like the wire, and then our own lama is like the light bulb that sheds light in the room that we're in.
되니 춤조 그나가 치도 용고나 되니 같이 되니 치고 먹거든 메나 되니 용탁고 말해서 되니 lok한 거는 거 lok도 되니 나초 사용고나 되니 그 받은 메나 용탁고 말해서.
If we don't have, for example, the pipe to transfer the water from the reservoir, or the wire to transfer the electricity from the power station, then neither the water or the electricity will be able to reach us.
디 나네 되니 가서 소라도 담니 되니 시나 되니 소라도 담나 되니 디 니바도 되니 다 능량제나 저거 니바 신름제나 라마고 신름 상기고 신름제와데 인경만 니바즈리지 능량제나 저거 더 되니 춤조 그나니 서서 용네 되니 가서 거서 용고나 되니 대 용치 그 짐선도 되니 가서 되니 되니 대 kusola soran de de ta tapashi ke ta soran de chu donation de disease tas chigris dondak chigris.
So one of the reasons that we visualize and supplicate these gurus of the past is that their blessing, the blessing that we receive from them by doing this, is a kind of power or energy.
teni jambachik teni kangre zenga nga chu sangi ge teni sung do so tamche po ani tata kwachuta tanchuta teni mambo yore zenga so ya yo inji yo bo yo mambo yore ta yina teni te nga chu so rang ge teni ta teni ti na ne teni changma de donda chama de nga chu shitab ko mares.
Another reason is that even though we have access to the teachings of the Buddha and commentaries on his teachings available in Tibetan, in Chinese, in many languages, reading them ourselves, we won't necessarily arrive at a complete understanding of their meaning. So it's the same as a university. If one didn't need a teacher, then one wouldn't need to come to university in the first place and pay the tuition fees. One would be able to look at a maths textbook and understand it without the instruction of a teacher. So it's really the same logic that obtains in the case of the Buddhist tradition, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So what we need to do is contemplate and use the teachings of past masters as the foundation upon which we do our own studies. In America, there are some people who say that it's not necessary to have a teacher, that one can read the Buddha's teachings oneself and put them into practice based on one's own understanding. Kempo says that in general, of course, one can do that. It's possible to read them and practice them, but in terms of understanding, obtaining a complete understanding, a thorough understanding of the Buddha's teachings, it's not possible to do so by oneself. So as a teacher or a professor is considered important in the school or university system, so is a lama or guru considered vital to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition.
Virginia in the Sutini Zambalanga Tola, Kardze, Sichuan, Serthar, Jimson, the Zamba Kamba Chimbo, but the Nimambo Jimson Marita, Gilgaya Jimson.
So the reason that people aspire to go to famous and influential universities in the world like Harvard and Columbia and the University of Virginia is not because there are a lot of people and they have beautiful buildings, it's because they have a reputation for excellent teachers. Because the quality of a teacher determines the quality of a student, this is the reason that the role of lama is so esteemed in the Tibetan tradition. However, there is a standard, or there's a standard for defining who is a qualified teacher, who is a qualified lama. In general, the term lama is kind of used very loosely, and people of different calibers are all referred to as lamas, but in the Tibetan tradition there's criterion by which a qualified teacher is held and assessed. So in the Buddhist tradition, a person who is not, who hasn't reached excellence in their studies or excellence in their practice cannot be considered a qualified teacher.
대패나 가지고 길근 손자치 먹으나 길근시구나 코로나 길근 것들이 황익 때문에나 길근시 맞춰 받아. 근데 가지고 되니 만칸칸라 만바시구나 되니 코로나 만바 것들이 더더니 황익 때문에나 되니 나발라 나타 맞춰 받아. 되니 직반도로 직바레스.
So it's the same as how we wouldn't recognize a doctor that didn't have their, their proper certifications, or a teacher who didn't have the proper certifications to teach. It's the same kind of logic. So saying that we don't need a lama, we can practice by ourselves, is the same as saying I don't need a doctor, I'm just going to self-medicate, or I don't need a teacher, I'm going to teach everything to myself. Mm.
So if we go back to the issue of the contemplation and why you visualize these people in front of you as you do these prayers to say, I want to be part of this bigger community of trust, I want to essentially develop this motivation to benefit others and so forth. What I heard in there, just analyzing it from a more university point of view, let's say, then I hear two things that I think we spend a lot of time talking about. One is that by visualizing this tradition, this heritage, these heroes and heroines of your own cultural past and so forth, that on the one hand it encourages an openness to tradition. It places a value to say, this tradition may constrain me in some other ways, but it also gives me a place. It opens up a set of knowledge and so forth. And a second thing is it opens us and makes us receptive to the value in the forms of relationships that we have with teachers and so forth. And these are things that are very familiar to us. We don't necessarily do that visualization practice every day, but these are topics that we talk about and think about a lot in America. And I have a very specific question about how someone who recently visited us, an American scholar and meditation teacher, who interpreted this practice in a little bit different way, and I wonder how he would think about that. The way that he interpreted it as, it's not just the fact that these are opening us up to teachers or opening us up to tradition, but that the people that you're imagining in front of you, they're not LeBron James or other kinds of figures. They're very specific figures who have an ethical relationship to the person that they're looking at. Because as you're involved with this practice and you're visualizing these figures in front of you, you're also imagining that they incarnate this deep values of compassion and kindness. And when they look at you, they're looking at you with this unqualified care, this unqualified compassion. And his feeling was that the more that he tried to think about what would be a secular analog to this, that he felt it was about imagining people that you had some experience with who had cared for you, who had exhibited deep compassion and kindness for you. And that for you to give that kind of gaze and that kind of care to other people, you first had to experience it yourself. And so by going back to your parents or a teacher or a friend or others that had given you that kind of unqualified compassion and care, that you could then begin to inculcate those values in yourself and exercise that towards other people. So it'd be a third interpretation of this simple one practice. And I wonder what he thinks about that interpretation.
Yeah.
Shetangatso gum gyabini kumna teni pernangatso teni lhanda tiris gumna teni lhati teni ta ngarang teni ngatso simchin tamchu pola teni hajang nyang jiwa teni mungdang zena Yeshe. Hachang yang jia tini the masu sama la tayo san tini gum go res. Tini gum na tini susorang ke jela tini yang ji jia la yang panto yore tini zena muchuk yu maris.
Kempo thinks that in general, when we are meditating on a particular deity, for example, we visualize that the deity is looking at us with great compassion, looking on us with great compassion, and as a result, we are able to generate compassion in our own minds. He finds this explanation that you offered just now, acceptable.
I'll convey that. Yeah.
But Kempo has some opinions in relation to the invention of new meditational practices in this regard. In terms of the manufacturing of pharmaceutical drugs in the West, there's a very strict and onerous process of researching the effect of drugs, for example, on guinea pigs, etc. And it's only when the safety or the specific benefit of the drug in question is ascertained that it is considered safe for consumption. So if we're going to develop new meditational techniques, then one has to essentially treat oneself as a guinea pig and do experiments on oneself for a very, very long time. Only after having done very thorough and long experiment and research on oneself with a new meditational practice and ascertaining that the meditation practice in question has benefit and no harm is one in a position to be able to then teach that to another. However, without this process of long-term research and experimentation, then even though it may seem that there is some short-term benefit in a particular new kind of meditation practice, it's difficult to say what the long-term effects or side effects of this practice might be. In general, though, if a meditational practice, if we use it for the temporary relief of stress or pressure of something, then generally speaking, this is something that wouldn't carry much harm.
So I have a question for him. In the history of Tibetan Buddhism, there have been a lot of disagreements about what meditative traditions are beneficial, which are not beneficial, and those disagreements continue until about a minute ago. So, given that, I wonder what he would say if the University of Virginia did really rigorous 10-year study of the impact of certain meditative practices done in his monastery and came back to him and said, well, actually, those aren't so useful. And that we've shown through analysis of people's brains and stress levels and behavioral patterns and so forth, that other meditation practice from that other community is actually a bit more useful for your monks and nuns. What would you do in that context?
Bodi nang de logic na la deni gom tap men rawa deni cheze ge panyo yo pe deni panyo yo tang meta ti thola deni zopa mombo yo. Any Catholic kozo da Larung Gar ka dini komthap University of Virginia kanala kozo ditola cheni de chinri pe kone dini shipju shimu sheni di yumbu sheni dini kozo ki dribu ina oda komthap di penyun chebu yomares demuzo ka shiru yena dini kozo ditanya de dini yana dini trupta shimbu ka komthap dile yasare yana kozo rangso so saru shibu komthap dile yasare kozo demuzo ka dini da zumji yena dini chepechi chizu samsi
Any kosa shimju mampo jeni da drupje pe salpo dini gyayik panga par gyur dini kyang gyayik chatsang lotuk gyur ra.
Serthar nga tso boba nangla dini jantha tso nangla dini jo dini zoba jawe da dini mambo yores.
In the Tibetan tradition, there is a lot of debate between the different traditions and schools, the lineages.
대 jimjip sheling da dini soso gerka dini samlo tang duli se khamsi. Gerka dini samlo tang la dini pe tapshi yakbo zres.
In terms of this being an exercise of one's independent capacity for critical thinking, this is a good thing.
이나 dini di zoba mangchi shu so nga so jumtha thola tasir kan ramra mambo res rema to pa gum muni tani nyamling umati thola zoba mambo yo mares.
Whilst there's a lot of debate and different opinions in terms of, the view or arguments, I suppose, around the theory, in terms of the actual concrete practices, however, there isn't as much or isn't so much debate.
차버도 되는 가서 배나 납쇼포더니 로자 진보나라 곰나 만큼나 곰나 소토 망지고 되니 곰도 소거와들이 망지 거와들이 자비더니 지 주지번 망지 거와들이 딜라다 딜리장들이 줄담들거든요 침부지요 말이지.
In terms of the meditational practices that are being brought into Western institutions like schools and hospitals and places like that these days, these are in terms of the Buddhist tradition, fairly basic and foundational practices, and so there's not really much debate about these or sense that they may be in some way harmful.
되니 있나요? 되니 나가 저 되니 라마 공마 망보고요. 맨 망보고 되니 문이 전에 그 냠뇽자도 소 공소 따요나 셔당 것들이 다 곰잡처리나 또 도랑 khipa 망보고 온자마다 따스 잠들이 마도 봐. 문이랑 그 냠린 제정나 또 도라 캬버 치부지지요 말이지.
So whilst there is in the Tibetan tradition a lot of discussion and debate and different opinions about theoretical questions or about questions of view, etc., or minute questions, in terms of the actual content of meditational practice, there is less debate.
딘디 나마 같으니 곰도 소 참아들이 다 보바 같으니 나라요 받도 소리나 야거니 말요 망치슈데 딘디 손디더니 mambo 같으니 다 곰잡 냠뇽 상티디 신이들이 종바스리 소라티니 지 네컵 같이 따스는 담으라 대지 마도 봐 자비 통이 딘디 노라 침보리로 기다 딘디 침보요 말에 소소 곰잡고서 시나 소소 마시니 능도 마시나 딘디 잠바 인칸다라 딘디 요레 마도 봐 소소 능도데 약보지 시소나
Since most of the meditational traditions that are in the Tibetan tradition come from India, with the exception of some, I suppose, additions or debates in the Tibetan tradition concerning, view and things like this, the content is pretty safe, and that a person who knows the content of the meditational practices and knows the theory behind them won't be in a position of risk. So in the Tibetan tradition, scholars have a lot of hair splitting over different theoretical questions, but in terms of those who are mainly committed to practice, they generally have a more open acceptance of the way that things are described and don't necessarily insist upon one definition of something at the expense of another.
Still, he didn't actually quite answer the question.
Shall we push it again?
So, yes, I'll push it again.
Okay.
So let's say that we did a study, and it was a very rigorous study that shows green visualizations really have certain kinds of positive impacts for people living in high altitude environments. And if you do black visualizations, then it tends to encourage depressive behavior, even though you and I are quite happy. But so that's a little bit of a silly analogy, but let's say they did that. Would he then consider maybe encouraging more green deity visualization instead of black deity visualization? Or experiment with it, play around with it.
연기하되 고소 University of Virginia나 나라들이 체인직밖에 고네데 십주 하종 체인직부터 tumbi 고네 십주 시니 되니 고소 다똑 가독 장국을 돌아 공부하여나 데 묵석 되니 사토금의 묵석 펜토요리 데 고소 십주 되니 십주 그 드레모 데모즈 톱나 되니 디타냐데 다 가독 장국 다 뉴스 되니 디 돌아 공부하나 데 고소 버강진 되니 사토금의라 되니 묵석 펜토즈 요나 고소 데모즈 되니 십주 랍시 시에토나 되니 가독 낙복 돌아양 되니 공부하나 되니 Penati toxa que ne mombo toya down teni nupa chepos a yena that demos a dribble the moose the chisati tseni petan tumbic dribbles a demos shuna teni kete demos a dribble yena cheto Larung Gar canala ni tok janko yana teni hlat janko ke gom jimondo teni gapki ein
Natso pena sem de la liban jamra mamboyo na mamboyo Tani natso nangba nangla tani the kharang ka tani gomthab ka thone sem ka nipa de khaifa sem ko to shekyo rete te khasang to mare tin ramra mambo yona chokores
in general
gos yona chokores
chokores
tini yona chokores tini yona ngaso sem zea de la nipa ramra mambo yores tini ti nipa ta tini ta thunjit jina ya khaifa jidere ngaso nangba ga tini the shiwo ke to shokchig ris tini yindi bela choso go tini z tini da jimjig z she jang na ya chokores tini z tini nipa tini sabaz tini bela university Virginia in na yana jambaz in na tini z ko khara go gomjam ne o tarung tila nipa jambaz tini tini sar ko tini z yojana famine z tini yojana te chokores
so the capacities of the mind are myriad, and it is I suppose the purposes to which Buddhist meditation techniques are applied in terms of generating or opening up or stimulating certain capacities or potentialities in the mind are only but some of the various potentialities of the mind. So if, for example, it were found that green had the meditating on or visualizing the color green had certain results, whereas black had other results, then there's no reason for this to be, this necessarily to be denied. The various effects that meditation could have on the mind, and the mind's potentialities are very many, doesn't have too much disagreement.
Teni tenji sona teni ngacho teni gomte yar chemang ro resina yante khorang ti niba de lata go res na niba de lata khorang reo de lata na pe na khorang teni goms sarwaz teni sarg teni yambos teni rasona teni tim reo to teni khorang gum khin jigina teni ngacho sama teni kelen ro res ngacho sama to gom yak res ta yena teni ta pe na Chupena Natsudini, Boka Chunyam, she get your dress in Ayanta Koran la Chatsang Yori, Korango, Zo Korango, Muir Mother, Korantini, Sangi and Tidizri, the La Koran Tashi Chatsang Yori, the Dina Koran Latini, Jambati Korala, Uncle Omar Mata Pashitan, Koran Latin, Geo to Kola Pantonkins, Queen, the killing grace.
So if, however, in terms of whether or not these findings would mean more practice on this kind of colour for the monks and nuns at Larung Gar, if it were, it would depend on the what the function or what the result of this meditational practice would be. And if it would be beneficial in nature, then sure, it would be no problem for people to put it into practice. However, having said that, in general, for Buddhist practitioners, their ultimate goal is the achievement of Buddhahood. And in respect of this goal, there is already a complete set of graduated or practices to do this. So, yes.
Now, I've been keeping an eye on the clock, and we do want to leave time for questions. We could go on like this for many hours. But just to briefly allude to the rest of the 7-year curriculum, that we're still on the 2nd year. So the 3rd year is what is called deity yoga practices, where you do these visualizations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and so forth, and you perform and recite their mantras. And the 4th one is the year where you spend on kind of interoceptive practices inside the body, or more like what we think of as yoga here in the US as well, but also doing visualizations in the body. The 5th year is on kind of concentrative practices or open awareness practices. And the 6th year then kind of continues that, letting go of objects of focus and concentration. And finally, the 7th year involves a lot of spontaneous visionary practices. So that's kind of a look at the 7-year curriculum that we're talking about. And maybe what we should do now is just, because we have already gotten a little bit into issues, I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and we'll be available until 7. So maybe my final question is, against that background of so many different kinds of Buddhist meditative practices of very different types, and he has been in the US now for the past month or so, and for the past week he's been talking to people at the University of Virginia who are taking these practices, some drawn from Buddhism, some drawn from other religious traditions, and changing them in order to bring them into a public setting where it's not appropriate to have religious values like an assembly tree of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, or a Christian prayer that you slowly intone to create a contemplative state of minds. And so I'm wondering, what are his thoughts about both the future of his own people, Tibetan people, many of whom are lay who do not do these practices, who are never going to be part of the monastery or the nunnery. And he's been talking to us about the potential value of this for patients or undergraduates or 6-year-old kids in a public elementary school. What does he think about this movement? And also, what does he think about its potential value back in Tibet?
야, 되니 다 캠포 디 유니버시티 virginia 용니 되니 고초 기긴다 10주시긴 공탑 그 콜라 되니 10주시긴 그게 되니 몸보 갑대시브레 냠데 갑대시브레 되니 고초 저 되니 공탑 되니 출력 되니 티베탄 주에 되니 차시 메베스니 되니 다 출력 공탑 되니 양은 롭적나라 되니 다 페시담와레 양은 되니 치스레 되니 멍칸카나라 페시담거레스 되니 다 고초 다 칼라카츠 되니 공탑 그 톨라 되니 사드 되니 시당 시리 요레스 되니 미몬부까지 지라고야 다티 인디 다 미몬불라 펜토 요레 네발라 펜토 요레 로마라 펜토 요레 되니 부중송솔라양 펜토 요레 다디 데모스크 아리기네즈지레 되니 따따 호크시 솔라다나 범미 몬부 다 검토 되니 자원이 겹기요 말에 그저 자원이 시기요 말에 그저 시당 그 되니 미kia 포모에는자 그저 공부나는 만중큰 그저 공그 소진 당 저와체 보여 말에 되니 아리 다 당상 그 되니 다 럽저 능 되니 መን강 야 되니 체크던디 아리 기네즈 당 보크 되니 시초라 저와 에요 되니 몸베 보크 시초 그 네즈 되니 유독 숑게 에요
shedanga gum jabzeyate ruwa mir zin satite sedang sizin na teni ta ari na da bobai na da teni chulula tapa yonken zin na da menken zin na da shedang sama gum te jab gumlus.
In terms of meditational practice, anybody, by virtue of the fact of them being human, regardless of whether they're Tibetan or they're Westerner, whether they're people with a religious faith or people without religious faith. These are all things that people everywhere should engage in.
Pena nga tso teni lipo teni ta jongder ke tondo teni chama teni lipo jongder ke shisa khamba nalandro chechen fangja khamba nalandro ni jongder jamada chia da yangna teni nga tso to shilola teni to chama Jigme teni jongder chia da lipo la jongder ta nga tso hale pa chama teni karchim polan zangdus.
So in terms of physical exercise, whether that be in a gym or jogging outside, these are things that most people consider very important and very legitimate.
Yeah.
And the mind is of equal importance. People should absolutely engage in training it.
Tapa yona chokore, tapa mena chokore, tapa yona korang tapa yopi tini gom tini japji yore, tapa mena korang tapa mepa toni gom japna tini japji yores.
So it doesn't matter if a person has religious faith or doesn't have religious faith. If they are of a particular faith, then they can engage in a meditation technique which involves or incorporates elements particular to that faith. And if they don't have a particular faith, then they can engage in a meditational practice that doesn't incorporate religious aspects.
Pena tini namba nala tini ta gom japli halipa mambo zori. Teyona ti nani gom jap sakte so tini korang tapa goni tini gom japna tini korang chure rores. Tini korang tapa mepa zak goni tapa menken zak tini ti nani yang kashi tini tapa menken so korang gomna chokore gomna korang semna panto counter yogore.
So in the Buddhist tradition, there are a great variety of meditational methods. And if one engages in them with a religious faith, then one is doing so as a religious practitioner and is doing so with religious objectives in mind. However, one could similarly engage in these methods without any particular religious faith. In any case, engaging in these methods would be of benefit to a person's mind.
Sem ga thola teni to khungcho kewi ne kamna teni khungcho de teni chunzum sia la teni namba no la teni halle pa ga thapsi teni mangpo do teni tenja boina teni tapa yon kan zu go gomna chokore tapa men kan zu go gomna chokore chama su zu go gomna teni rew tak chi pares tenja boina rew chi pares.
So in the Buddhist tradition, there are a lot of meditation techniques for dealing with anger, the arousing of anger and controlling anger. Anyone can do these practices. It doesn't matter whether they have faith or not, and the result is the same for everyone. It's of equal benefit.
Teni yang ina ti nala teni jirchu ti zbe na America ta wala teni ta mo teni tapa menken teni zko teni gona teni tela teni pe na ngasu namba na la yo pa teni chipa chi chang chi ni gomna yo te yang kapkas jang tanglin chi thap ma teni yo jere te na jirchu sawi thola teni no pa me pa shini teni kala kansam ko jirchu jamna te na ga yo mares.
So in terms of America, if people without Buddhist faith are taking on or engaging in Buddhist meditational practices, then it may be necessary to do some level of modification to the practices. It might not be possible for them without faith to engage in the full host of meditational practices that require some aspect of faith. In general, if these modifications are done in a suitable way that doesn't lead to any harm taking place, then this is okay.
Tini tiramni shi tsachik bandi na la thondi tini nga tso tini to nurshogre ta sharshogla yon tini tini gosum gu mamboz gu gum gu thola to nam shi dus.
So in the 21st century, it's not just people in the West, but also people in Asia too, who are paying a great deal of attention to meditation.
Tini tiram jorge pa jirga pa tiram nishi pa to tesola tini nga tso gum nam gu tini gum gu thola tini zo mang chi shu ti gum gu thola to nam shi mand zo nga tso lipo gu tini ndoba ta kaya tini zaji ta gyonji ta tini gu thola tini samlo tani tini ti thola pamjur gu thola ndama bu jawaris.
Whereas in bygone centuries, the past 200 years, people have tended to pay more attention to the needs of the body and material needs, food, clothing, etc., and have not been as concerned with meditation. And the materialist preoccupations of the 18th and 19th centuries are something that we now realize to have been mistaken. Many people during these centuries, or up until the 21st century, particularly influential people in society, advocated the idea that economic progress is all we need, or economic progress is essentially the main thing. And the influence of this kind of ideology was extremely great all over the world, in the East as well as the West. And the reason that this ideology is in fact, or was in fact, mistaken is that it was a very immature ideology. But then starting in the 20th century, people started to gain the realization that fulfilling one's physical needs without paying attention to the needs of one's psychological well-being is not, what's the word? Sensible. And the reason that these days people are paying a lot of attention to meditation is that we really have incurred a lot of suffering. We've incurred a lot of stress and a lot of pressure in our lives, and for this reason people are really becoming very interested in meditation. So as a result of affluent people in developed Western nations realizing that having fulfilled their economic needs or their material needs, they're still not feeling happy, they're still suffering, this realization has had a great impact on people in the East who look to the West and think, oh, well, if rich and affluent people over there think this way, it must be right. Yet there is still a great number of people who don't accept this at all and think that how could it be that if we won't be happy if we have a lot of money? The acceptance of the idea that material progress may not be everything is not all pervasive by any means. So, in general, when we understand what it means to be human, we can understand it from the point of view of humans being animals, and animals all being sharing a similar characteristic. The first thing that humans, like animals, need to do is find food when their stomachs are hungry. And then after they've filled their stomachs, then they can start to think about all manner of other things. But in this respect, the Tibetan tradition or Tibet is a little bit different. And different because even though there are or have been a lot of people who have been materially speaking not very well off, maybe still hungry, etc., they've nevertheless recognized the importance of meditation. However, in terms of actual practice, it wasn't the case that every single person in society were meditation practitioners. The main people who engaged in meditational practice were those monks and lamas who tended to congregate in monasteries. And at the same time, it's not that everybody who lived in a monastery was a meditator either, but in general, there were a great number of meditating practitioners in monasteries. In monasteries too, there were people, or monks, who didn't have particularly high levels of education or academic attainments, who would perform ritual services for people, for the villages, for example, when people died. Within lay society, traditionally speaking, the number of people who engaged in meditation practice was very, very few. However, in looking for the reason as to why there was so little lay meditational practice in Tibetan society, we shouldn't try to find the reason in the religious doctrine itself. From the point of view of, from the pure religious point of view in Buddhism, anybody is entitled to practice, whether one is male or female, poor or rich, a lama or a lay person. There is no scriptural or religious limitation on who can take part in meditational practice. Traditionally speaking, in Tibetan society, among the lay population, the standard of education was quite low and illiteracy was widespread. And for this reason, giving teachings on rather complicated meditational practices to people in the lay community would be difficult. It would be difficult for people with low levels of education to obtain good understandings of these practices. In the lay population, there was at least some extent of meditation, rather sort of simplified meditational practices. So meditation on Amitabha that would require the recitation of his name and some simple visualization, but in terms of really complicated, complex, graded visualizations and things like this wasn't prevalent in the lay population. And this is the background of the Tibetan situation, the history of Tibetan. In terms of the work that's being done to spread understanding of meditational practice in lay communities, Kempo has embarked on this work, and Larung Gar has embarked on this work now for a period of about 10 years. But the reason that people are, lay people are taking to these practices in Tibetan society is not to reduce their, their stress and pressures in everyday life, really, or because of the prevalence of depression or things like this. And the reason that they're not engaging in meditation for these reasons is because that society has not arrived at the point in Tibet where things like pressure and stress and depression are widespread social phenomena. But the point at which Tibetan society will arrive at a situation where these illnesses and problems become pronounced is when everybody has fancy cars and big houses.
So we're running a little bit late because, translation is, as I say, a contemplative way of listening to a lecture. Since you have a lot of time to not actually be listening to anything. So, but we have time for a few questions from the audience. If anybody has a question for Kempo.
It was mentioned that to attain enlightenment, it would be necessary to have a teacher. According to my understanding, I could be wrong, the Buddha himself attained enlightenment, or a state of enlightenment, that none of his contemporaries had done. So if the Buddha could do it on his own, could not one of us do it as well?
So the question was basically, given that the Buddha himself was said to have attained the level of realization that his peers lacked, why couldn't that happen in a contemporary circle? Why do you have to have a teacher who has already realized what you aspire to?
Yes, a good question. However, it's not. Yes, we can't say that the Buddha did not have a teacher. If you were at the level of the Buddha when he existed in India at that particular time, then yes, perhaps you wouldn't need a teacher. It's like being a PhD student in your final stages. At this point, you probably don't need much instruction from your teacher. However, until one reaches that highly advanced stage, one needs teachers to assist them in the stages up until that point.
If you have a teacher, this is another similar question. If you have a teacher that you establish a relationship with, and they leave the body and they die, is it possible for that person to guide you after they've left their body while you still have yours?
Lama jitena, lama di tetsa bejes, deni tetsa ni, deni tetsa bejes, lama di mutundu di chukutola, deni da chutukere.
chutola kare.
Da di lama tetsa bejes, lama metsa bejes. Oda deni rangnila, deni daru mutundu, deni chutukere.
Rangnila mutata. Ya. Deni shirtang, deni lama tena, lama mandipi gungni. Ini korang ke gom jabluta nyamne shirta ta chama teni ta yaboz teni lojong shi thosong yona teni lama den desona teni kyo mares.
In general, if one has thoroughly learned about, the content of meditational practices and the meditational techniques, etc., has learnt these thoroughly and well before the passing of one's teacher, then in general, it's one's in a okay position if one's teacher then passes away.
Teni ta pena teni korang ke teni gum nyamlin de te chini te ta sama ya position na te zramba te chen thombo ra o teni thoyona ti ka se teni lama de sona ya teni lama de chang jisiang korang ke teni panchen teni ta lama toni korang ke lojong shi thapje ra o teni yong gore se zramba te chen thombo zin na.
If one has reached a relatively high state of practice or realization prior to the passing of one's teacher, then it's possible after the teacher's death that some relationship or some continued instruction and guidance could take place.
Nguni tani lama nguni tani lama yapo tani chatang dambaz yin. Tani loma yang tani tezi tani nyamlin riba tezi thombo ra o tani yin na. Ani laman de made ta korang jongla yo patan de made la chapri chichi yo mare korang namin na korang gang teni to ba tsa na gang na korang teni to jitham kres.
If the teacher in question is a really truly qualified master and the student is similarly quite advanced in one's practice, then actually it doesn't matter whether the teacher is alive or has passed away. Regardless, the teacher will be able to provide guidance to the student. And if the relationship between the teacher and the student is like this, then it's possible for them to meet, as it were, in another realm. And if a student hasn't reached an advanced stage of practice prior to the passing of their teacher, then after the passing of one's teacher, they would need to then find and rely on another teacher and continue with their study and practice.
So my first question is, what's the difference between cultural religion and Buddhism? And then whether Buddhism is a religion or some kind of cultural religion, or is a tradition, or is a pure science?
Yeah. Anyway, they like Japan. Tambo ne na ni ba de Japan. Na ni ba de draw ni ba la. Draw ni ba de na is na shetan rimnisia de la de de bilo jatam ba na la. De rimnisia de Kardze la ze re ze ne tim chanyi de no shoko de nim chanyi pa na go wang shi na tani sanin ramra gyata tikchi reji na tani zindogsi kora ga tingi rini tindizri te zelim ramra gyata tikchi reji na tani zindogsi
Oh, yeah. Okay. So over the past 100 years, there's been a lot of different definitions of what, in fact, constitutes culture in the West among social scientists and the humanities. And so there are many different opinions in this regard. There's not one united or singularly agreed upon definition of culture. So in order to answer the question of whether or not Buddhism is a cultural religion or not, we first need to look at what we actually mean by the term culture, and only then can we really interrogate the question of whether it is a cultural religion. So even though there are many different opinions on what culture is, there tends to be a standard approach of classifying religion within the realm of culture. And by this way of classification, the more general category is of culture, and then religion is then a specific category within that. And according to this way of looking at things, there is no such thing as religion without culture, or a non-cultural religion. So even though we often refer to culture and religion separately, in actual fact they belong together. So there is one way of looking at things which would describe religion as being part of a local cultural tradition. So one might talk about the Tibetan religious and cultural tradition, or the Indian religious tradition, or the Chinese religious tradition. So, for example, when Indian artisans create tankas of the Buddha, they render his face in an Indian way. And when Chinese artisans render the Buddha, they do so according to Tang Dynasty conventions, where the Buddha is fat and white and happy and bulbous. Yes. And in the Tibetan, the Samye tradition of Thangka painting, they rendered the figures according to the Tibetan, the highest standard of Tibetan aesthetics of physical form. And these practices or conventions had benefit for people in particular places being able to relate to and adopt these religions.
Rete yena teni zavi thola teni ta yo mare yagre na da teni mobile na da yana na da zavi thola teni chaparji yo mare te chapar yo nye nya mare ma to pa teni popa ga chiushi yagre ga chiushi yana ga chiushi america ga chiushi teni chiu da teni nang chu mai bare lo res.
However, at its basis, at its crux, there is no such distinction in Buddhism. If we start talking about a Chinese Buddhism or an Indian Buddhism or an American Buddhism, then essentially the idea of Buddhism disintegrates.
Okay, so maybe one last question. Is there, maybe we'll just try to diversify the gender, so we'll finish with a female voice.
lay practitioner 就是居士在家中，如果9年，每天花2个小时，非常认真的修持的话，是有可能拿到证明的。因为Kempo您已经在北美，我是今年年初您在台湾给的一系列演讲当中是听音频的，听到这样 statement。那您在北美已经大概旅行超过大概有1个月了，那就您对北美大陆的观察，你觉得这样的建议要在这个地方做，这个地方需要有什么样子的？Okay, my question is, according to one of Kempo's lectures in Taiwan, he said for a lay practitioner, within 9 years, if they really dedicate to their practice 2 hours a day, and then he guaranteed there is a high possibility for lay practitioners to achieve enlightenment. So it was a big encouragement to all of this. Yeah. And so I asked Kempo, given the fact that you have been traveling in North America for almost 1 month, and given your observation, and how do you think, if you would like to make a similar statement here, regardless of the year, maybe 11 years, I don't know, what kind of cause and conditions or preparations this society or this culture needs to do for you to give such a statement? Like, for example, like, I don't know, package of, I don't know, manual of practice, or like the advisors or teachers, etc. 我刚刚说的是说，那些准备可能包括了需要有什么课程啊、教授啊、师资啊之类的，我不太清楚，所以我想要请问你。
那就是게다 누가다 데리지기도 간디리즈나 셔당 긍이 봐요 말이야. 가시나 되니또 이 당니 보제거나 뒤통통거 나라더니 그런 것들이 정부즈나 고와 고속 옆에 견도 근데 요리 가시나 이 랑보 있나요? 되니 다른 들이 먹고 근데 요레스 셔당 들이.
Okay. So even though Kempo did say the 8-9 year thing, in actual fact, you know, there is no fixed way of saying these things. For some people, they might obtain great realization in a shorter period of time, whereas others may need a much longer time. So it's very difficult to put it in as easily, quantifiable terms as say how many years it would take you to graduate from an undergraduate university course. So when Kempo made the comment about 8 or 9 years, he was referring to the fact that within that time it would be possible to do the ngongzho, the preliminary practices, and then shamatha practices, and then meditation on emptiness, and that if one did those practices in a diligent way and obtained the results of those practices as they're intended, then it may be possible to achieve awakening in that time. So within 8 or 9 years of serious and diligent practice, in any case, it would be possible to obtain some meditational experience and realization. Some people may, in fact, realize the nature of emptiness in this time, but in any case, it would be, one would be able to generate a good meditational experience in this time. And so the comments that Kempo made in Hong Kong probably, apply to the American context as well, where the conditions or the circumstances of people who have to hold down everyday jobs in America, their limitations of their time is probably similar to the situation elsewhere. But if they were able to meditate in the morning and meditate in the evening and be diligent in their practice, then probably the results they could obtain would be exactly the same.
Should we ask them about Australians? Okay. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for staying with us, and we hope you enjoyed today. So let's express our appreciation for